I never thought a normal morning could turn into the start of a nightmare. My property, my little slice of peace, had always been my sanctuary, a place where the only sounds were birds, wind, and the occasional bark of a dog. I'd spent years protecting it, maintaining it, dreaming of one day passing it down to my kids. But that morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, something felt wrong. At first, it was subtle. Small stakes appeared along the edges of my property, dotted in the grass like tiny white flags marking invisible territory. I frowned, thinking maybe it was some surveying work for a neighbor's project. But then I noticed trucks. Big trucks, bulldozers, concrete mixers, and they weren't parked on the street, they were rolling across my land. My heart sank, and I felt a strange mix of disbelief and anger. I picked up the phone and called the HOA office. I expected apologies, maybe a mix-up. Instead, I got a voice so calm and smug it made my blood boil. "We're building homes here now," they said, as if they were announcing the weather. "Your land." I wanted to scream, but I kept my voice steady. "Excuse me, that's my property." Silence, then a chuckle. "We've got everything under control." And just like that, my world tilted. I stepped outside, squinting at the morning sun, reflecting off the shiny machinery now tearing through fields I had cared for since day one. The smell of fresh-cut wood and wet cement filled the air, a nauseating reminder that what I'd built with sweat and love was being erased. I felt frozen, unable to move, yet my mind raced. How could this happen? Why wasn't anyone stopping them? Neighbors began to appear, drawn by the noise, curiosity, or maybe gossip. Some whispered their support, shaking their heads. "This is crazy," one said, staring at the chaos. Others were awkward, uncertain, clearly afraid to cross the HOA. And there I was, trapped between fury and strategy, because I knew, even in that moment, that losing my temper wouldn't help. If I played my cards right, I could turn this disaster into something bigger than anyone imagined. I spent that morning walking along the edge of my property, touching the stakes, watching the machines bulldoze the first patches of land. I tried to imagine what the court would say, what the law would allow. But the more I watched, the more I realized they weren't making mistakes. They were bold, reckless, and entirely convinced they were untouchable. And yet in that arrogance, I sensed an opening. I remember thinking, almost aloud, they have no idea what they're digging themselves into. And maybe they didn't. Maybe they saw me as an old property owner who would complain, write a few letters, and then give up. But I had other plans, plans that would require patience, cunning, and a little bit of luck. Plans that would make them regret every nail they hammered, every brick they laid. As the sun climbed higher, shadows stretched across my land. Concrete trucks roared, and the smell of fresh asphalt mixed with anxiety. I poured another coffee, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. Every machine, every worker, every misstep by the HOA was now part of a larger story, a story I was determined to control. And in that quiet moment, standing in the middle of what had once been my untouched land, I made a promise to myself. I would let them build. I would let them finish. And when the time was right, I would pull the rug out from under them in a way they would never see coming. Because they thought this was just about houses. They thought they could own what wasn't theirs, but I knew the truth. This was about more than land. It was about respect, about justice, about showing that no one, not even a powerful HOA, gets to steal what belongs to you. And so, with a deep breath, I watched as they continued their destruction, every pile of dirt, every nail, every brick pushing me closer to the moment I would finally strike. Little did they know the storm was only just beginning. By the next morning, my property had transformed into a war zone. Bulldozers rumbled across my fields, cranes lifted beams into the sky, and the unmistakable smell of fresh cement filled the air. I walked to the edge of my land, squinting at the chaos, heart pounding. Every machine that moved across my property felt like a personal attack. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Neighbors gathered, some shaking their heads, others whispering, "Can they really do this?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was obvious. This was no mistake, no misunderstanding. The HOA had crossed a line, and they were practically daring me to stop them. I stepped closer to a bulldozer, trying to get a look at the foreman. He didn't even glance at me, busy barking orders at his crew. There was a weird thrill in watching their arrogance, in knowing they thought they could just take what wasn't theirs without consequence. I clenched my fists, taking deep breaths to calm the storm of anger and disbelief inside me. I started taking notes, every truck, every worker, every mistake. A foundation had already been poured and one of the forms was crooked, causing a pool of wet cement to spill over. I smiled just slightly. Little things like that mattered. They were sloppy, overconfident, and utterly convinced no one could touch them. That would be their downfall. And then came the HOA president, striding across the land like he owned the world. Red face, perfect suit, shiny shoes, completely out of place on a construction site, but completely in his element in terms of ego. He waved at some neighbors as if he were a celebrity and muttered something about progress and vision. I wanted to laugh, and I almost did, right there, watching him trip over a mound of dirt. The scene would have been funny if it weren't my land being destroyed. The audacity was infuriating. They thought they could steamroll me, make me small, and eventually I'd just disappear. But I wasn't going anywhere. I spent that day walking among the workers, asking polite questions, smiling when appropriate, recording every slip of paper, every misstep. My phone was full of photos, videos, and notes. Each mistake they made, each careless move, was a brick in my case against them. By afternoon, the air was thick with dust and tension. One of the workers accidentally hit a water pipe, sending a geyser of muddy water shooting into the air. For a moment, I froze, my stomach churning at the sight. Then I realized I could almost hear Karma laughing. Their overconfidence was catching up with them, and I couldn't wait to see how the story would end. That night, as I sat on my porch, I looked at the 96 foundations, half-built homes, and all the chaos they had caused. The moon reflected off piles of lumber and fresh asphalt, giving the scene an almost surreal glow. I sipped my coffee, tired but not defeated. I knew the next few weeks would be brutal, but I had a plan. I whispered to myself, let them build, let them finish. Every nail, every brick, they're just digging their own trap. Patience was hard, but it was my weapon. And every time I imagined the courtroom, the judge's gavel, the look on the HOA president's face when I presented my deed, I smiled. Even then, though, I couldn't ignore the suspense. Would they discover what I was planning? Would they try to stop me before the time was right? Every sound of machinery, every shout from a foreman, felt like a countdown, ticking closer to the moment I would strike. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the distant hum of trucks and the occasional crash of falling wood, I felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. The invasion had begun, yes, but it was also my opportunity. They thought they had won, but the truth was they were just building the stage for my revenge. Tomorrow, the real game would begin. And I wasn't just going to fight them. I was going to make sure they never forgot the day they tried to take what was mine. The next few weeks felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. Every day I watched as 96 homes slowly took shape on my land. Foundations poured, walls rose, roofs went up. Every nail, every brick, every inch of progress was a dagger in my chest. Yet I said nothing. I let them work, let them believe they were winning, while inside I was plotting. Some people might call it madness. Letting someone build on your property, watching them destroy what's yours. But patience was my weapon. If I stopped them now, I would have only provoked a battle they weren't ready for. By letting them overextend, by letting their arrogance grow unchecked, I was turning their strength into their weakness. I walked through the site almost every morning, keeping my hands clean but my mind busy. The foremen didn't recognize me as a threat. They assumed I was just another neighbor complaining. I smiled politely, nodded at their progress, and took mental notes. Look at them, I thought. So sure of themselves, so blind. And they made mistakes. Oh, plenty of mistakes. One crew laid a line of bricks crookedly, causing a wall to wobble. Another misread a blueprint and built a porch that jutted into the next lot. They argued, cursed, and blamed each other while I quietly documented everything. Each error was a future nail in my case, each misstep a step closer to the courtroom showdown I was waiting for. The HOA president, of course, visited daily. Always the same red suit, the same fake smile, acting like a king surveying his kingdom. We're creating a legacy, he told a neighbor, pointing to the growing rows of homes. Legacy. I wanted to laugh so loud it would echo across the entire neighborhood. But instead, I just nodded and smiled. Let him talk. Let him boast. Every word he uttered was evidence of arrogance, evidence that he had no idea what was coming. Some days the stress was unbearable. I paced the edge of my property late at night, watching shadows stretch over the half-built homes, listening to the distant hum of generators. I could feel my heart racing, but I also felt a strange exhilaration. I was patient, but I was alive. Every day, the anticipation grew. When would the moment come to strike? How would they react when they realized their so-called victory was actually their downfall? And then there were the small, absurd moments that kept me human. A worker spilled a bucket of paint across a fresh deck. A foreman tripped over a power cable. A delivery truck got stuck in the mud, completely blocking the street. I couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself. Life has a way of sneaking in little ironies, and I took comfort in these tiny reminders that the world has a balance of its own. Even my neighbors began noticing the tension. Some whispered questions, others nodded in silent support. I didn't speak much. Actions, after all, would speak louder than words. I let them watch me walk the property each day, calm and unbothered, even as their machines tore through the land I loved. I let them think I was powerless. I let them feel invincible. But every night I returned home and reviewed my notes, my pictures, my videos. Every misstep, every error, every foolish boast was catalogued, and with each one the plan became clearer. Patience had a price, and soon they would pay it. I couldn't help but imagine the courtroom already. I saw the judge listening intently as I laid out proof, each photo and document a hammer striking their arrogance. I imagined the HOA president's face when reality hit, when he realized that all 96 homes, every inch of construction, had been built for nothing. My pulse quickened at the thought. By the end of the third week, I had learned something important. Letting them finish wasn't just strategy, it was poetry. Watching them build, knowing the endgame, made me almost giddy. Every day, I reminded myself that patience is a weapon the arrogant often underestimate. And as I looked out over the almost complete neighborhood one evening, the sun setting behind the horizon, I whispered to the empty fields, "Build all you want. Finish every wall. Because when the time comes, this victory will be mine, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." By now, the HOA was fully convinced they had conquered my land. Every day, newsletters boasted about our vision for the neighborhood, and social media was flooded with photos of perfectly aligned streets, freshly poured sidewalks, and shiny roofs glinting in the sun. The audacity was breathtaking. They weren't just building homes, they were building an empire on property that didn't belong to them. I attended a few of their so-called progress meetings, blending into the background like a ghost. The HOA president, puffed up like a peacock, strutted around, shaking hands and speaking to anyone who would listen. "We're creating a legacy here," he announced, voice booming, eyes gleaming with self-importance. Legacy? I almost laughed out loud. Little did he know, his empire was perched on a foundation of arrogance, and that foundation was about to crumble. Every word, every boast, every gesture they made was a mistake I catalogued. I kept my notebook close, jotting down every ridiculous claim. "We've already solved all legal disputes. No one can touch this project now. This is permanent." They were practically writing my victory speech for me. I smiled politely, nodded at their grandiose plans, all the while imagining the courtroom, imagining the judge's gavel, imagining the stunned silence that would greet their downfall. The neighborhood started talking. Some neighbors came up to me privately, shaking their heads, whispering, "Do you see what they're doing? They've gone too far." Others nervously expressed admiration for the HOA's efficiency, completely unaware that their so-called heroes were bulldozing someone else's property. I listened quietly, feeling a mix of amusement and dread. It was surreal to see how blind people could be when arrogance hides the truth. And then came the small disasters. One crew poured cement on the wrong foundation, another built a fence that completely blocked a neighboring driveway. The president tried to spin it, claiming minor setbacks are normal, but I couldn't help but smirk. Each small error added to the chaos they thought they controlled. Every miscalculation was a future weapon in my hands. The more they flaunted their success, the more I realized that arrogance was their greatest weakness. Their confidence blinded them. They assumed I was powerless, that I would scream, protest, or give up. But I stayed calm, serene even. Every day I walked the property, inspecting each home, silently marking each flaw, each nail hammered in incorrectly, each misaligned wall, each bureaucratic slip. It all built the case I was preparing. I began to see a strange rhythm in their chaos. The more they celebrated their progress, the more mistakes they made. The more they flaunted their control, the easier it became for me to plan my next move. And the more they underestimated me, the stronger my advantage became. Yet even in the face of their stupidity, a shadow of doubt crept in. What if they tried to stop me before the time was right? What if they discovered my plan? I spent nights reviewing my notes, photographs, and legal research, packing the quiet fields while the wind rustled through the half-built homes. Every creak of wood, every hum of machinery felt like a countdown toward the confrontation I had been waiting for. By the end of the week, their arrogance had reached new heights. They scheduled a grand showcase of their progress, inviting neighbors, investors, and the media. I attended, blending in, smiling at their triumphal speeches and watching the president beam like a man on top of the world. But inside, I was calm and patient. Let them celebrate. Let them believe they were untouchable. Every boast, every laugh, every handshake was a thread I would later pull to unravel them completely. As I left the showcase, I took one last look at the 96 homes, now almost complete, rows upon rows stretching across my land. The sun was setting, painting the neighborhood in shades of gold and orange. I felt a strange mix of tension and exhilaration. Their empire was nearly finished, yes, but it was about to become the stage for their greatest humiliation. I whispered to myself, almost like a promise, build all you want, celebrate all you want, because soon you're going to wish you never set foot on my land. And with that thought, I walked back to my house, heart racing, mind sharpening, and patience tightening like a coiled spring. The real battle was coming, and this time they wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. The air was thick with tension as I stepped into my home, the distant hum of machinery on my land echoing in my ears. 96 homes had been built, or at least mostly built, on what was legally and undeniably mine. Every morning I walked among them, every nail and beam a reminder of the audacity I was facing. And every evening I returned home, my mind consumed by one thought: courtroom. I knew this wouldn't be easy. The HOA was powerful, experienced, and shameless. They had networks, lawyers, and connections I couldn't even begin to imagine. But I also knew I had something far stronger: the truth, the law, and patience on my side. For days, I immersed myself in paperwork, reviewing deeds, surveying records, old maps, and any document that could prove beyond a shadow of doubt that this land, and every inch of it, was mine. I met with my lawyer, a calm but razor-sharp professional who immediately understood the scope of the battle. "They've overstepped every line," he said, thumbs tapping the edge of a thick binder filled with evidence. "They've practically built a stage for your victory. You just have to play it right." I nodded, but inside my mind was already racing ahead, imagining the courtroom, the judge, and the moment I would finally confront the HOA's arrogance. Nights were the hardest. I'd sit in my study, piles of papers surrounding me like a fortress, and go over every possible scenario. What if they tried to settle before court? What if they called in more lawyers, more experts, more threats? My stomach twisted at the thought, but I reminded myself of one undeniable truth: they had no idea what was coming. Every misstep they had made during construction, every miscalculation, every boast, it was all ammunition. I also had to manage the emotional toll. Walking past 96 homes built on my land every day was like seeing someone slowly erasing your life's work. Anger bubbled inside me, threatening to boil over, but I kept it under control. Every time I felt my patience waver, I reminded myself, let them finish. Let them feel invincible. And when the time is right, strike with precision. Humor became my secret weapon. Sometimes the absurdity of it all made me laugh quietly to myself. One day, a worker accidentally painted a garage bright purple instead of beige. Another day, a delivery truck got stuck in mud, blocking a whole street. Every little disaster made me realize the universe had a sense of justice, albeit slow and ironic. Neighbors began noticing my focus and determination. Some approached me, whispering warnings or sympathy. "They're ruthless," one said. "Are you sure you can fight this?" I smiled, replying only, "I'll see you at the end." There was no point in explaining the strategy. Letting them feel invincible while I built my case in silence was far more powerful than any words. And then came the moment that changed everything. My lawyer uncovered a critical oversight in the HOA's paperwork: a missing signature, a misfiled permit, a loophole that could blow their entire claim apart. I remember staring at the document, heart hammering, adrenaline surging through me. I whispered under my breath, "They really thought they had me, and now they're going to wish they never touched my land." Preparation became obsession. I went over each document, each photo, each video multiple times, ensuring nothing could be missed. I mapped out the courtroom sequence in my mind. When I would speak, when the HOA would stumble, how the evidence would hit like a hammer. The suspense was intoxicating. I could feel the moment of confrontation growing closer with every passing day. Every night I stood by the window overlooking the 96 homes, bathed in the cold glow of streetlights. They looked like a small city, perfectly built, utterly unclaimed. But I knew the truth. Every brick, every beam, every wall had been built for nothing. And soon, very soon, I would pull the rug out from under them and justice would finally be mine. As I closed my notebook and turned off the lights, I whispered to the shadows, "Prepare for court. Prepare for the moment when you realize all your arrogance, all your power, all your so-called victory means nothing." And with that, I knew the game was about to change forever. The day of the trial arrived faster than I expected. I woke before sunrise, the sky still dark, and for a moment I paused by the window, staring at the rows of 96 homes that had been built on my land. They looked like a small city, silent and unaware of the storm about to hit. I sipped my coffee slowly, tasting the tension in the air, feeling my heart thundering, not from fear but from anticipation. I arrived at the courthouse and stepped inside, trying to appear calm, though every nerve in my body was alert. The lobby was buzzing with whispers, and I could feel the eyes of strangers on me. But my attention was on one thing, the HOA. And there they were, sitting proudly in the front row, faces smug, thinking they had won before the first word was even spoken. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers moved papers, clerks shuffled files, and the judge, a stern but fair presence, looked over us with quiet authority. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I reminded myself, this is your moment. You have the truth, you have the law, and you have patience. The HOA president stood as their lawyer began to speak, outlining their case. They boasted about permits, timelines, and community improvements. Every sentence dripped with arrogance. I could feel the tension in the room rising, and I knew I had to wait for the perfect moment. Patience was still my greatest weapon. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, letting the weight of the room settle on my shoulders. I began calmly, methodically, detailing the history of the land, the purchase, the deeds, and my years of ownership. My voice was steady, but inside, adrenaline surged. Every word was calculated, every pause purposeful, building suspense for the moment they wouldn't see coming. Then my lawyer presented the evidence, photos, permits, and most importantly, the deed. I watched as the HOA president's smug smile faltered. Their lawyer stammered, trying to counter, but every claim was dismantled one by one. I could almost feel the energy in the room shift, the audience leaning forward, eyes wide. Their confidence was crumbling. Humor crept in silently. The president, once so proud, now fumbled over words, gesturing desperately. It was almost absurd. These people had built an entire neighborhood on my land, and now they were powerless to stop me. I stifled a smile, remembering the months I had waited, the patience I had practiced, and the strategic calm I had maintained. Every mistake they had made during construction had become ammunition in my hands. Witnesses testified, permits were scrutinized, and every misstep of the HOA was exposed. Each revelation added to the suspense, each piece of evidence making their case weaker. I could hear the whispers, the shocked gasps, the scribbling of notes as the reality became undeniable. They had built 96 homes, yes, but on land that wasn't theirs, and every wall, every roof, every street would now cost them dearly. The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled, listening carefully. I could feel the tension like a tangible force pressing down on the room, and then came the moment I had been waiting for, the deed. My lawyer handed it to me, and I presented it calmly, deliberately, as if unveiling a masterpiece. The room seemed to hold its breath. The HOA president's face turned pale, lips quivering, eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't, this is impossible," he muttered, shaking his head. But the evidence spoke louder than words. My land, my property, my rights, everything was validated, undeniable. The room erupted with murmurs, the air thick with shock and awe. I felt a surge of triumph, but I stayed calm, letting the moment sink in. This was the culmination of months of patience, observation, and careful planning. Every home, every mistake, every arrogant move had led to this. The suspense, the tension, the emotional roller coaster, it had all been worth it. As the judge nodded, Acknowledging the validity of my ownership, I realized one thing. This wasn't just a victory over an HOA. It was proof that patience, strategy, and courage can overcome even the boldest arrogance. And as I walked out of that courtroom, heart racing, adrenaline still pumping, I knew the story wasn't just about winning. It was about teaching a lesson they, and everyone watching, would never forget. The courtroom was silent, thick with tension. I could feel it pressing down like a physical weight, the expectant gazes of neighbors, the curious onlookers, the HOA president's smug aura slowly unraveling before my eyes. All their confidence, their bluster, their belief that they had won, was about to collapse. I stood slowly, holding the deed in my hands. The leather-bound folder felt heavier than it had ever been, not because of its weight, but because of the power it contained. 96 homes had been built on my land, every inch of it a bold declaration of arrogance. And now, in a few words, a single piece of paper, I was going to prove that all their efforts, all their bragging, all their so-called victory had been for nothing. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing, curiosity evident. "Go ahead," he said, his voice calm but expectant. I opened the folder and laid the deed carefully on the table, sliding it toward the court clerk. The room felt like it had gone still. Every heartbeat was magnified, every whisper seemed distant. My voice was steady, deliberate as I spoke. "This deed proves that the land on which 96 homes have been built belongs solely to me," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "Every foot of property, every wall, every street, every home, built without my permission, without legal claim, is on my land." The HOA president's face shifted. First came disbelief, then panic. This isn't possible," he stammered, hands trembling, fingers fidgeting with his suit. His lawyers exchanged nervous glances, shuffling papers frantically. The smugness that had carried him into the courtroom was gone, replaced by something far more fragile, fear. I watched almost in slow motion as the truth sank in. Months of arrogance, months of mockery, months of thinking they were untouchable, all crumbled under the weight of the law. The court clerk carefully examined the deed, comparing it with records, checking signatures, verifying details. Every movement, every action was a drumbeat in a crescendo of suspense. "You built on property that is not yours?" the judge asked finally, voice even but firm. "Yes," I replied, calm but resolute. "They built 96 homes, they celebrated, they bragged, but none of it was theirs to claim." The room seemed to hold its breath. The neighbors, the spectators, even the attorneys, all watched as the HOA president flailed, trying to find words that didn't exist. His face was red, sweat gleaming on his forehead. We didn't know," he mumbled, but the court had already seen every piece of evidence, every record, every misstep. A whisper of satisfaction ran through me, quiet but electric. This was the moment I had waited for, the apex of months of careful observation, patience, and strategy. Every home, every nail, every mistake they had made during construction had built itself into a trap, and now the trap had sprung. The judge nodded, tapping the gavel lightly. "The deed is valid. Ownership is confirmed. The defendants will acknowledge that all structures are built on property belonging to the plaintiff, and remedies will be determined accordingly." Shock rippled through the room. The HOA president's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, words failing him completely. His empire of arrogance had been exposed in one dramatic moment. The audience gasped. Some laughed quietly, others shook their heads in disbelief. And I stood there, calm but triumphant, heart racing, every nerve alight with satisfaction. I knew this wasn't just a legal victory. It was a vindication of patience, strategy, and justice. They had thought they could intimidate me, overwhelm me, and steamroll me. Instead, they had built the stage for their own downfall. Every brick, every wall, every home was a monument to their arrogance, and my triumph. As the judge continued with the details, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Their shock, their panic, their disbelief, it was everything I had imagined and more. The deed had spoken. Their empire had crumbled without a single raised voice from me. The suspense, the tension, the months of waiting, it had all been worth it. And as I left the courtroom later, glancing back at the rows of homes that were no longer theirs to claim, I realized the truth. Sometimes, patience is more powerful than rage. observation more powerful than confrontation, and justice more powerful than arrogance. The storm was over. The deed had spoken. And in the silence that followed, I finally felt the weight of victory settle, like the sun breaking through clouds after a long, tense night. The courtroom was finally quiet. The deed had spoken, the judge had ruled, and the truth was undeniable. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence wash over me. 96 homes built on my land had been a monument to someone else's arrogance, but now they were a monument to patience, strategy, and justice. Leaving the courthouse, I felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The sun was high, reflecting off the nearly complete homes that had been the center of my nightmare. For months, I had watched them rise, step by step, every beam a challenge to my patience. Now, they stood not as a victory for the HOA, but as a reminder of how blind arrogance can be. The HOA president's face was a picture of disbelief. He tried to speak to me outside the courtroom, words tumbling out in panic, but I didn't answer. There was no need. Actions, evidence, and the law had already done all the talking. He had built an empire on someone else's land, and now, without a single word from me, it had crumbled. Neighbors began approaching, some cautiously, others with wide-eyed admiration. "I can't believe it," one whispered. "You let them build and still won?" I smiled, shrugging lightly. "Patience," I said. "Sometimes letting them think they've won is the most powerful move of all." The murmurs grew into quiet laughter and nods of respect. The story of their arrogance and my victory was spreading fast. Walking past the 96 homes, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. I had let them build, yes, but it had been necessary. Every mistake they made, every oversight, every moment of arrogance had become part of the plan. And now every wall, every roof, every street was part of the proof that justice, when wielded patiently and wisely, can triumph over even the boldest opposition. The HOA scrambled in the aftermath, lawyers calling, contracts being revised, apologies attempted, but none of it mattered. They had overplayed their hand. They had thought power, money, and intimidation could silence me. Instead, they had built the stage for their own downfall. And the truth was out. No amount of influence or ego can replace the law or common sense. I took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. This was more than just a legal victory, it was a lesson. A lesson about patience, about strategy, about standing firm in the face of arrogance and bullying. A lesson that even when it seems like the world is against you, the right combination of calm, planning, and courage can turn the tide completely. And humor, I realized, had helped too. Watching the president stumble, watching his pride collapse, watching the world finally see what I had known all along. There was a strange satisfaction in it, a quiet comedy hidden inside the chaos. But it wasn't about revenge. It was about proving that doing things the right way, patiently and deliberately, is far more powerful than any rash reaction. By evening, as I walked through the fields bordering the 96 homes, I felt a sense of closure. The machines were gone, the contractors had left, and the HOA had no claim over what was mine. The tension, the anxiety, the months of uncertainty, they were behind me now. And the satisfaction, quiet but deep, was mine alone. I paused, looking out at the sunset reflecting off the rooftops, golden and soft. "You built on my land," I whispered to the empty fields. "You thought you had control, but patience and truth always win in the end." The wind rustled through the trees, almost as if agreeing, almost as if whispering back that justice had been served. As I turned to leave, I realized something important. Victory isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about strategy, observation, and timing. Sometimes it's about letting your opponent reveal their own flaws. And sometimes it's about standing quietly, letting the world notice the truth while the arrogant stumble. I walked home slowly, heart full, mind clear. The HOA had lost, I had won, and the lesson, both for them and anyone who witnessed it, was unforgettable. 96 homes, thousands of mistakes, and one decisive deed had changed everything. And in that moment I knew, no one will ever underestimate me again. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.